Well, hello minders, welcome back to the Mind of Watercolor, and I'm here in Photoshop today. We're going to jump right into this. We're going to analyze a couple of things that I have found are problems with especially beginners or new students who are trying to learn landscape. And this has nothing to do with the painting. This has to do with drawing or rendering the scene. And just to be clear, drawing is not necessarily with a pencil. Drawing is any time you render an object or a scene yourself, like from scratch, like you draw it basically. And that can be with watercolor, that can be with pencil. Essentially, unless you're coloring an image that's already drawn, you're drawing the image at some point. You're rendering a scene based on a photo you have, or a photo you're using, or even on location. Now, when I was teaching last year and I taught 2 sessions of a landscape class, these were 2 problems that I saw crop up again and again. And it really just kind of constitutes a shortcoming in understanding a way a scene is composed. There are 2 aspects to this, and I consider these 2 to be the most problematic in rendering a scene. And they affect everything in the scene. The first is planes. And that is just not being aware of planes in a 3-dimensional space and how to render and draw in 3-dimensional space. Now, when you render anything, when you look at a scene, you usually have your main ground plane. Now, we're going to deal with just typical situations, not unusual situations. And the typical situation is that you're standing looking at a scene, okay? And it may be, great distances, it may be short distances, whatever. But you're looking through space. Your eye line is the horizon line. And whenever you look at a scene, whenever you analyze a scene that you're going to draw or paint, you need to start understanding where the planes are. Generally, you have a ground plane, or everything that most closely associates with that ground plane. And then you need to understand everything more closely associated with vertical planes, maybe a tree line. And I realize that tree lines are not flat cutouts, but this is just for the sake of illustrating what planes items are associated with. And those planes that these elements are most closely associated with will be at different distances in your scene along that ground plane. So when you're dealing with things like trees, mountains, even clouds and water, they're going to be associated more closely with a vertical plane or a horizontal plane. Always keep that in mind. Okay, again, I realize that mountains actually have dimension and they go in the horizontal as well as the vertical, but you see a lot of vertical. So now the point I'm making here is when you're looking at a scene, every bit of this distance means something in perspective, and this is not going to be a perspective tutorial, all right? Those can get quite technical, and literally perspective is an entire course. You can spend hours learning about perspective, and a lot of that applies to more geometrical shapes like buildings, but it also applies to more amorphous type situations like landscape. Thankfully, it's not as technical. The more you study it, the more you get to know certain aspects. And really all these processes that I'm going to show you will do is just make you more aware. All right, let's go back to our first photo. Now, I picked this photo to look at because it's a more typical photo, and it's got this ground plane, right? That's very obvious. Now, not all scenes are going to have an obvious plane, but the person who took this photo was standing on that ground plane. Now, in perspective, you have what's called the horizon line. The horizon line is always your eye line, always. Horizon line, a lot of times, is illustrated. If you look in perspective books, instructional books, they'll say it's where the sky meets the land or the ground. Well, that may be true if you're looking at the ocean, but it's not always true in a scene like this. Where these forest or this tree line meets this field is not the horizon line. The horizon line would be above that because your eye line is probably right about here. Okay. Now we don't have any buildings, so vanishing points aren't a huge thing right now. But let's just say for argument's sake our vanishing points right here, and that'll just allow me to draw some grid lines. Okay, I'm just going to lightly put these in. But this is being aware of the plane that you're dealing with. And items, if let's say if there's a horse here, a horse further back here, you know, is going to be smaller. And it's going to sit, you know, depending on where it sits on the ground. Here's a horse here, the one sitting back here. Size, so size is important. Also detail is important, but where along that line does everything sit? You know, I drew these little blobs here for horses, just maybe right in front of that tree line. So let's just draw in a portion of that tree line. The point is, you just need to analyze these and what this space, this three-dimensional space, is doing. Number one, where they sit on the plane, okay, where they are position wise, what their size is. These horses are all on small vertical planes of their own. Now mountains, while they will roll in perspective, they're most closely associated with the vertical plane. This one, here's another one that's farther away, so you know that one's farther away. Analyze how far away your objects are, and just be aware of it. Just simply be aware of it. Now the next thing is to then look at color and detail. Oh, and by the way, and I'm not going to draw in the whole grid, the sky is a plane. It's sort of the mirror of this. It's actually a plane going away from you. And I've drawn all over this. We're going to go to another photo. Let's look at something a little more complex, okay? Where would the plane and the horizon line be here? Well, I'm looking at this and thinking my horizon line, my eye level is right about here. That would be a center vanishing point maybe. So it's just slightly above this ground because I'm standing on a hill, it looks like. And that's where it looks like my eye line is. So that's my horizon line. Not here, not here, not here. That's important to know. This will be our center vanishing point. Now with that plane in mind, you can see anywhere along the plane where things sit. And now what do you do with this information? Well, the first thing is you study what distance does to the objects in the scene. Where they are on the plane, number one. Where they sit. Number two, the amount of detail. And this is really important. Look at the leaf detail in this bush versus this. Look at the color in both of these and the contrast versus, say, this one. We have a lot of atmosphere in this scene, one of the reasons I chose it. So it's exaggerated, but look at the color. As it goes further back, it gets bluer and less contrasty. Let's analyze the perspective for a minute. Here's a little bush. If I were to bring that forward, and that kind of fits my two little lines here. If I were to bring that forward, here's how big it would be. If I were to bring it forward up here with this bush, it's roughly that big. Okay, so just study these things with a sense of curiosity. You're not necessarily trying to say, okay, well, I should always do this or I should always do that. Not everything in painting and drawing is a rule. It's sometimes just a sense of curiosity and awareness, and teaching yourself to be aware of what's happening in the scene. Let's analyze the planes one more time before we go. So here is a vertical plane, and I do realize that these things have dimension. So in reality, it's not a cardboard cutout. I understand that. We have a plane here created by this tree line. We have another one. This tree line is a little farther behind. This mountain or hill here goes behind all of those, and then we have another more distant one here. And I'm just going to get rid of where these vertical planes are. I'm going to get rid of these ground plane lines. And we're going to look at this again like we did our little pop-up drawing in the beginning, okay? Now again, I am aware that a hill is really coming forward in space as well as going vertically, but which plane is it most associated in the scene? So we have our little pop-up. I can't tell you how many beginners I see, even intermediate artists, that take these ground planes and they raise the perspective of the ground. That's a really common problem, is tilting the perspective so that you're seeing things as if you were up above them looking down. A common problem is water, for instance. A lot of times, if a creek or a river were going through here, you'll see people render it like too wide and coming downhill as if you were looking at it from aerial. All it takes to master this kind of thing is this type of analysis and observation, and that's all we're doing here. What do you glean from that? Well, the chief thing, and again, a huge problem I see all the time, is incorrect scale. Study scale until it just really starts to make sense. This is a great example. Now this is fog, so it's exaggerating the atmospheric effects that are happening here. So look at this detail versus this. Darker, of course, less contrast, more detail. Very important. This is a really good example of what in a scene atmosphere will do. We'll say, well, how do I know how to make it? How do I know how much contrast to delete? Well, that's the artistic part of it, but you know, the more atmosphere there is and the farther away it sits on that plane, the more distance an atmosphere is going to affect it. It's going to be smaller. If you look back here, I don't know if you can see that. Basically, we just have little sort of cloud-like rendering. There's almost no detail at all. So scale. And this is what I'm talking about. Let's look at a different example. There are several things here. And whenever you're examining something or analyzing something, don't leave anything out. There are several things here that at first you may not be even aware of that are affected by the scale. Now, first of all, we have an obvious plane. I'm not going to grid it, but this is a rising hill, it looks like, and it looks like our eye line is right about here. So where the top of this hill is, we do sort of have a natural horizon. But the first is, and most obvious are the trees. Trees vary, so that's one of the great things about landscape is you have some room for play in terms of size and proportion. But look at the average. So if we're studying the scale of these trees, some small ones, this is probably the smallest one here in the foreground. The biggest one in the foreground is this. Compare that to if we go way back here in the back. The smallest one might be this one. It's very hard to see. You're looking at the average size basically and seeing how they scale. If you had one tree that was the same going all the way back, you would have a better sense. But you're just kind of looking for an average. And that is something, though, that you want to make sure that you represent in your drawing. You want to get an overall average of decreasing size as you go. These are very, very important visual clues when you're rendering a scene. Another one would be the leaves. And so look at the leaf detail here. This is a foreground clump. You can see a lot of detail. Now you might simplify that, of course, if you're painting. This is sort of a mid-foreground scene. You're seeing almost individual leaves. But as you get back here, you're mainly seeing patches of color. There may be some of you that just, this is very obvious and you're saying, yeah, I know this, but you don't know how many times I see this violated, that artists just don't pay attention to distance, where their subject is along the plane, and how that distance is affecting the scale. The scale comes into play in several ways, and I'm just going to write these over here. Most obvious one, size. Let's put scale here as our subject. Okay, scale affects size. This is the equivalent of proportion. You know that when you draw a human face or human head, proportion is extremely important. If your eyes are too high or they're too low, or your nose is too long, or the mouth is not in the correct place, all that proportion is key in rendering a face or a human head that looks convincing. The equivalent to that in landscape is scale. So size probably being the most important. Let's look at just a few more. We looked at the leaf detail, and I'm just going to write that down there too, because that's sort of a subcategory of size, I suppose, is the amount of detail. Because as detail gets smaller, the less you're going to render it, the more you're going to simplify it. What else? Well, this path. Notice how it narrows, and that's a perspective issue. That's probably one of the most common perspective things that you see, is a dwindling path, one that goes off in the distance, a road. Look at the shadows and the light that's filtering through the trees as it falls across the path. Look at the long length of it here. See how it gets shorter and thinner as it goes. Look at the leaf detail on the ground. Another subcategory of size would be texture. It could be something else. It could be stone, or it could be waves. Detail and texture, all affected by scale. And as we saw in that previous photo, atmosphere will affect contrast. Well, you say, well, that's a function in landscape of the atmosphere. Well, it is, but they're still related, because scale is closely related to distance. So we live in a world where there is atmosphere, and in the most exaggerated situations, like that fog scene I showed you, it reduces contrast. But that's linked. You just might consider that that's sort of a linked aspect in landscape with scale. Let's take a look at this photo for a minute. This is kind of interesting just to see, because a lot of times when you're looking at forest scenes or scenes where there are wood lines, the perspective, if there's not a building there or something like this with rows, the perspective is not obvious. But this is a case where the sky and the mountain meeting the ground, I think, pretty much is the horizon line or eye line. And we have a natural grid here. And a lot of times in a distant scene, we're just not as aware of that kind of receding detail. Just look at the little stakes for these plants and watch as, let's see if I can get in here closer. Look how the detail decreases as you go back. So these kind of farm scenes I love to look at. Color, mostly here. These sticks are so close together, they almost just look like texture. And not until you get up to the foreground do you see their pipes with any kind of a thickness. These are great little observations to make. It's why painting from reference and studying reference is so important. You know, I preach that if you watch this channel very often, and I just want to give you more and more tools for how to analyze your reference and how to make yourself more aware of these things. I want to look at one more thing with scale. Actually, I want to look at two more things. Let's look at this desert scene first. The clouds. Mainly what I want you to see here is the clouds, although this is pretty cool. If you look at the amount of detail and contrast in this distant mountain, it's almost not at all. And I know we see these things and recognize them, but you need to make sure you incorporate them. My eye line is about here. It's just above this road. It's probably the base of this distant mountain, I think. It's my eye line. And the sky plane is going to obey that same horizon line. So this cloud right here, up here, is going to be maybe that big. I think you get the point. I don't want to belabor the point too much, but this is what separates really well rendered scenes, convincing representational scenes, if that's your goal, if you're trying to paint and draw realistically, representationally. This is what separates this from stuff that's stylized, cartoony. Children are famous for drawing things flat. If you've ever noticed a child's drawing and how everything appears on a flat plane. Children have a hard time understanding perspective, so they draw everything flat. You'd be surprised how many adults will get the perspective and lift it up so that it's not correct and have a cloud in the distance that's just as big as a cloud in the foreground. So let's look at one last one. Look at the waves and the texture in the water. This is another great example of texture and scale. These things in particular, detail and texture. But just study carefully how much they recede. By the time you get to the back end of the midground here, you have almost no detail. And by the time you get to the back of the lake, it's solid color. Can't tell you how many times I've seen ripples in lakes and ocean drawn this size way back here. That's a huge disconnect for making something look like this actual scene, like a realistic scene, if that's your goal, which most of those paintings I saw was their goal. And this is pretty much the horizon line, I would say. It looks like whoever took this photo was either sitting in a boat or maybe sitting on a dock, because their eyeline perspective is really low. It's right about in here where the natural water is. And a lot of times when you have water, if it goes off very far in the distance, that is your horizon line. That usually is your eye line. These are great studies, great observational studies. I hope this was a help. I hope this is something that will have you looking at landscapes a little differently, and the planes and the scale and how that affects everything. Thanks everyone, I appreciate it. Thank you patrons so much for your support, and we'll see everybody in the next video. Bye-bye.